Rome did not begin losing control at the frontier. It began losing control inside its money. For centuries, the Roman Empire looked like the strongest system on earth. Its armies marched across continents. Its roads tied distant provinces together. Its laws, taxes, and markets reached from Britain to Egypt. From a distance, it looked permanent. But power has a weakness that maps do not show. An empire can hold borders for a long time while something more dangerous begins to fail underneath them. Trust. And in Rome, that trust lived inside a coin, small enough to fit in a hand, important enough to hold together trade, taxation, wages, and military loyalty across an entire world. That is the first paradox of this story. Rome was not undone first by invasion, but by distortion. Not first by defeat, but by dilution. Because inflation, in its oldest form, was never just about prices rising in the marketplace. It was about power reaching into money and changing what society believed it was holding. So, the real question is not simply why Roman prices rose. The real question is darker than that. When a state can no longer fully afford its promises, does inflation begin as an economic accident or as a political solution? Throughout history, states rarely weaken money because they misunderstand money. They weaken it because they understand power. When a government can no longer raise taxes fast enough, borrow cheaply enough, or cut spending without risking unrest, defeat, or political collapse, it faces a brutal choice. It can admit the limits of its power, or it can reach into the currency and buy more time. That is the central thesis of this story. Inflation, in this sense, is not just an economic malfunction. It is often a political transfer, a way of moving pressure away from the state and into society, away from the treasury and into wages, savings, prices, contracts, and daily life. The burden does not disappear, it changes hands. What the state cannot fully finance, the public is forced to absorb slowly, unevenly, and often without a formal vote. This is what makes inflation so dangerous in history. It does not merely reduce purchasing power, it rearranges trust. It changes who is protected first, who pays later, and how long political authority can survive without solving the deeper problem. To understand why inflation became such a dangerous political tool, we have to begin with the thing Rome got right. The denarius was not just a coin, it was a system of trust made portable. Introduced during the Roman Republic and strengthened as Roman power expanded, the silver denarius helped do something extraordinary. It gave a growing empire a shared monetary language. A merchant in one province, a tax collector in another, and a soldier on a distant frontier could all recognize the same piece of silver and accept it with confidence. That mattered more than it may seem. Rome was not held together by roads and legions alone. Roads moved goods, legions enforced order, but money allowed that order to circulate. Grain could be sold, wages could be paid, taxes could be collected, contracts could be honored. A state stretching across vast distances needed more than authority. It needed a medium people trusted when authority was far away. That is what the denarius provided. Its silver content was consistent enough to make acceptance feel natural. And once that habit of trust took hold, it did more than support trade. It helped stabilize daily life. It linked provincial markets to imperial power. It turned distant rule into something ordinary, repeatable, and believable. This is the deeper point. Money did not simply serve the Roman Empire, it helped organize it. But this is where the Roman story becomes darker. The same state strong enough to build an empire was also strong enough to quietly distort the money that empire depended on. That is the paradox. Political authority gave Roman coinage its reach, its legitimacy, and its force. A denarius traveled far because Rome stood behind it. It moved through markets, tax offices, military camps, and ports. because people believed imperial power would preserve its value. But that same power contained another possibility. The authority that could guarantee money could also alter it. And that is what makes monetary history so unsettling. Money is never protected from power by power alone. If the state controls the mint, the standard, and the law, then trust rests inside a structure that can defend value, or quietly bend it. The public sees the same emblem, the same face, the same official authority. Yet beneath that surface, the substance can begin to change. This is why inflation, in its oldest political form, is so hard to recognize at first. It does not arrive looking like collapse. It arrives wearing the symbols of order. Empires do not become dangerous to money when they are weak. They become dangerous to money when they are expensive. And Rome was expensive on a scale few societies had ever attempted. Its frontiers stretched across deserts, rivers, mountains, and coasts. Legions had to be stationed, supplied, and paid. Roads had to be maintained. Forts had to be rebuilt. Grain had to move. Officials had to administer taxes, law, and transport across distances so vast that local failure could quickly become imperial disorder. But the deeper cost was not only material. Rome was not simply paying for walls, ships, and salaries. It was paying for obedience, for military loyalty, for provincial stability, for the daily appearance that the center still ruled the edges. In a system that large, money did more than fund operations. It kept hierarchy believable. That is where fiscal pressure becomes political pressure. Because once an empire grows accustomed to permanent armies, permanent administration, and permanent strategic commitments, the bill does not arrive once. It arrives constantly. And when that bill keeps growing, the state must find a way to meet it, or find a way to hide it. Rome did not destroy its monetary order in a single act of madness. It began with something smaller, and therefore more dangerous. Under Nero, in the 1st century CE, the empire faced rising financial pressure. Military costs were growing. Imperial spending was heavy. The burdens of rule were no longer temporary. They were structural. And instead of confronting that pressure directly, the state made a quieter adjustment. The silver content of the denarius was reduced, not erased. Reduced, that distinction matters. Because monetary crises rarely begin with obvious panic. They begin with decisions that appear manageable, technical, even reasonable from the point of view of power. If each coin contains slightly less silver, more coins can be minted from the same stock of metal. More payments can be made. More obligations can be met. The state gains room to breathe. At first, almost nothing seems broken. The coin still looks official, the emperor's authority still stands behind it. Trade does not stop overnight. But this is how trust begins to change, not with noise, but with dilution. And once a government discovers that money can be stretched to delay pain, the temptation rarely stays small. Here is the first secret. Inflation does not always begin in the marketplace. It often begins much earlier at the point where power decides who gets paid first. That detail matters because new money does not enter society evenly. It arrives through channels of priority. In Rome, that often meant the army, contractors, officials, and the machinery of rule. The first receivers of altered or expanded coinage could still spend it before the wider market fully adjusted. They used yesterday's prices with tomorrow's money. That is the hidden advantage. By the time the coin reached ordinary trade, the effects had already begun to spread. Sellers asked more. Weighing became more careful. Doubt moved outward. But the earliest gain had already been taken by those closest to power. So inflation was never only about money becoming weaker. It was about distribution, about sequence, about who was protected first and who absorbed the change later. Once the silver content falls, the mechanism begins to move. Less silver in each coin means more coins can be struck from the same stock of metal. More coins mean the state can cover immediate obligations, military pay, supply contracts, transport, administration. For a moment, the problem appears contained. The treasury is not healed, but it is relieved. Then the second stage begins. The market notices, not all at once, not everywhere at the same speed, but merchants begin to weigh more carefully. Sellers ask more for grain, oil, tools, and transport. The same official coin still circulates, yet its real credibility starts to separate from its legal face. That separation matters. Because once prices rise, wages come under pressure. Soldiers, laborers, and suppliers all want compensation that still feels worth accepting. The state then faces a new burden: higher nominal payments inside a weaker monetary system. Tax receipts become less effective in real terms. What looks like revenue on paper buys less in practice, so the answer becomes the same again: more coin. This is the deeper logic of inflationary breakdown. Not one bad decision, but a loop. Debasement creates relief. Relief spreads doubt. Doubt raises costs. Rising costs demand more money, and the system begins feeding on its own weakness. Once a state discovers that money can ease fiscal pressure, the real danger is not the first change. It is the precedent. Nero's reduction of silver did not end Rome's monetary order overnight. But it introduced something far more durable than one policy. It introduced permission, a new way of thinking inside power. If the coin can be adjusted once, it can be adjusted again. And over time, that temptation hardened into method. By the early 3rd century, under Caracalla, the Roman state took the logic further. A new coin, the Antoninianus, was introduced with an official value above the old denarius, yet without a matching increase in real silver content. In effect, the state was claiming more value than the metal itself could honestly support. That step mattered. Because this was no longer a small technical reduction hidden inside continuity. It was escalation. A sign that the government had begun leaning more openly on monetary appearance to solve political and fiscal strain. The promise stamped on the coin was moving further away from the substance inside it. And once that gap widens, trust becomes harder to repair. A society can survive a burden. It struggles to survive a pattern. This is where inflation stops looking merely financial and begins to look openly political. In Rome, the army was not just a budget item, it was the decisive institution of power. Emperors did not survive by abstract legitimacy alone. They survived because soldiers were paid, rewarded, and kept loyal. In moments of instability, that loyalty could determine who ruled. And who did not live long enough to rule at all. That changes the meaning of money. Once the throne depends on military support, coinage becomes more than a medium of exchange. It becomes a tool of survival. A ruler under pressure does not expand money only to meet expenses. He expands it to secure obedience, to calm unrest inside the barracks, to make promises faster than the treasury can honestly afford them. And that is how inflation enters the bloodstream of politics. Because once soldiers expect higher pay and rival claimants promise richer rewards, the currency is pulled into a struggle it cannot escape. More coin can buy time, it can buy loyalty, it can even buy a crown, but it cannot do so without a cost. The more Rome relied on money to purchase military allegiance, the more the value of money itself was dragged into imperial succession, fear, and force. And this raises a harder question. When money begins to purchase loyalty, is it still functioning in the old sense of the word? Or has it become something else? Because money, at its strongest, helps a society coordinate. It allows strangers to trade, workers to plan, taxes to be gathered, and obligations to be settled across time. It reduces uncertainty. It makes order feel ordinary. But once coinage is increasingly used to hold together a frightened political system, its role begins to change. It no longer moves mainly through trust. It begins moving through pressure. At that point, money is still being counted, still being spent, still being accepted, but beneath the surface, its purpose has shifted. It is no longer simply helping society function. It is helping power postpone consequence. It is buying silence in one place, obedience in another, and time everywhere else. That is the darker transformation. A currency can survive being used. It struggles when it is used to delay reality. And once that line is crossed, inflation is no longer just weakening money. It is changing what money is for. This is the point where inflation stops feeling abstract and starts entering ordinary behavior. Merchants become more cautious. Sellers ask for more coins, not because they suddenly become greedy, but because they no longer trust that today's payment will still hold value tomorrow. The same denarius still passes from hand to hand, yet each exchange carries more hesitation than before. That hesitation spreads. Those with means begin moving toward safer stores of value, better silver, gold, land, durable goods. Others fall back on older habits. Direct exchange returns, grain for tools, oil for cloth. Local arrangements begin replacing wider monetary confidence. What had once been a shared imperial language starts fragmenting into smaller zones of survival. And that is the deeper social cost. Inflation does not only change prices, it changes behavior. It changes what people trust, what they hoard, what they refuse, and how far they are willing to depend on strangers. Once that happens, daily life becomes narrower. Markets grow less open. Communities grow more defensive. The empire still appears intact from above. But below, ordinary people have already begun pulling away from the money that once held them together. But the damage did not stop in the marketplace. It moved into the state itself. Taxes were still collected, of course. The machinery of empire did not vanish overnight. Provincial officials still gathered revenue. Coin still entered the treasury. Records were still kept. On paper, the system continued to function, but weak money creates a quieter form of disorder. When the center collects in currency that buys less and less in real terms, fiscal control begins to erode from within. The state may appear to receive revenue, yet that revenue no longer carries the same force. Once it must be turned into grain, transport, military pay, or administrative action. The treasury fills, but its reach shrinks. That changes politics. Provincial authorities, commanders, and local elites begin relying more on their own arrangements, their own supplies, their own networks of loyalty. Not always out of rebellion at first, but out of necessity. When the center cannot convert taxation into reliable power, the edges begin learning how to survive without waiting. And that is how monetary weakness becomes political fragmentation. The empire still stands in form, but inside it, authority is no longer moving with the same confidence as before. A weak currency does not just impoverish a state, it shortens the distance between local self-protection and imperial disobedience. By the 3rd century, Rome was no longer facing one problem at a time. It was facing pressure everywhere. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Armies backed rival claimants. Civil wars broke out inside a state already strained by frontier threats, administrative overload, and a weakening monetary foundation. This is what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. But the deeper danger was not simply that Rome had many emergencies. It was that the system was losing its ability to absorb them. That is where money matters. Inflation did not cause every invasion, every coup, or every imperial murder, but it made each shock harder to contain. A weaker currency meant weaker fiscal control. Weaker fiscal control meant more fragile loyalty. More fragile loyalty meant more political improvisation, more emergency payments, more short-term fixes inside an already unstable order. And that is how crisis begins to compound. Money became both symptom and accelerant. It reflected the empire's strain, then helped spread that strain further through pay, prices, taxation, and military allegiance. Rome was no longer dealing with separate failures. Its monetary weakness had begun tying them together. That is when decline becomes more dangerous than defeat, because a system can survive pressure for a long time. What it struggles to survive is losing the ability to stabilize itself. Here is the third secret. Societies do not usually break at the exact moment. Prices rise the fastest. They begin to break when people quietly withdraw from shared monetary trust. That is the deeper threshold. As long as people still believe the currency remains the common language of value, a system can absorb astonishing strain. Prices may rise, wages may lag, trade may become harder, but the structure still holds, as long as most people continue acting inside the same monetary reality. The real danger begins when they stop. When merchants prefer hidden exchange to official trade. When savings move toward gold, land, or private stockpiles. When favors, family ties, and local loyalties become more reliable than public money. When provincial power matters more than imperial promise. At that point, inflation is no longer just a monetary problem. It becomes a fracture in the social order itself. Because a currency does more than move value, it allows strangers to trust the same system. Once that common trust is replaced by black markets, personal networks, and local protection, the official structure still stands, but it no longer organizes real life. And that is when the crisis becomes deeper than inflation. It becomes a slow exit from shared civilization. By the time Diocletian came to power, Rome was no longer dealing with a temporary disturbance. It was dealing with a crisis of confidence. Prices had become unstable. Coinage had been weakened over time. Trust had thinned across markets, wages, taxation, and supply. So the state turned to a familiar instinct of failing systems. If confidence cannot be restored, perhaps behavior can be controlled. That was the logic behind Diocletian's edict on maximum prices. The policy attempted to place ceilings on the prices of goods and labor across the empire. On paper, it looked like order, a direct assertion of authority over inflation, a declaration that the state would decide what things were worth and force the market to comply. But this is where the tragedy becomes clear. A government can threaten merchants. It can punish sellers. It can issue commands. What it cannot do is force people to believe that weakened money still deserves old trust. If the currency no longer holds value reliably, then lower official prices do not solve the problem. They merely drive exchange elsewhere. Trade retreats. Goods disappear. Black markets grow. And so the deeper lesson is not only that price controls failed, it is why they failed. Rome was trying to repair a monetary crisis with coercion, when the real damage was already inside belief. The state could command prices. It could not command confidence. Rome did not recover by argument alone. It recovered, in part, by restoring something people could trust again. That is where Constantine matters. The solidus was not a magical cure for every wound in the Roman world. It did not erase decades of strain. It did not undo civil war, administrative pressure, or the long damage done by debased silver. But it did something more important than symbolism. It offered a coin whose value could once again be believed. And that changes everything. Because once money regains credibility, power regains range. Payments carry more force. Trade can move with less suspicion. Reserves become meaningful again. A state can still be feared without being trusted, But it cannot govern well for long unless at least part of its monetary order becomes believable again. That is the crucial contrast. Not every reform fails. But successful reform does not rescue the whole old world at once. It stabilizes what can still be stabilized. In Rome's case, what returned first was not innocence, it was selective confidence. The old silver order was fading, but a new monetary center of gravity had emerged. And that is the counterpoint to this entire story. When money has been used too long as a political instrument, order can only be rebuilt around the forms of value society is still willing to trust.
The mechanism has changed, but the
Today,
temptation
states
remains.
no longer shave silver from coins in a mint. The mechanics have changed. The temptation has not. Modern money is more abstract, more centralized, more technical. It moves through central banks, credit systems, public debt, and digital balance sheets rather than hammered metal. But the underlying political pattern is still recognizable. When debt rises, war expands, growth weakens, or social pressure intensifies, money is drawn toward the center of power once again, not always recklessly, not always dishonestly, but almost never neutrally. Because money remains the fastest way for a state to buy time when other choices are too painful. Raising taxes creates resistance. Cutting spending creates anger. Admitting limits creates political danger. Altering the monetary environment, by contrast, can seem cleaner, quieter, easier to justify. That is what makes Rome feel uncomfortably close. The lesson is not that every monetary expansion leads to collapse. History is more precise than that. The lesson is that whenever money is used too long to absorb pressures that politics refuses to resolve, trust begins carrying burdens it was never meant to carry. And once that happens, the crisis is no longer only financial, it becomes civilizational. Inflation has survived across centuries not only because economies are fragile, it has survived because, to power, it is tempting. It offers delay. Delay of hard choices, delay of visible failure, delay of the moment when a state must admit that its promises have outrun its means. That is why this story matters. Rome did not stumble simply because prices rose. It stumbled because money became a way to postpone truth. And every time that happens, the bill does not disappear. It moves into wages that buy less, into savings that feel less secure, into markets that trust less, into households, provinces, and communities forced to reorganize around uncertainty. That is the real cost. Inflation is never only a technical disturbance inside prices. It is a social transfer of strain, a political decision whose consequences are scattered across ordinary life. The state buys time, society pays in confidence, and once confidence begins to thin, people do what people have always done. They protect themselves first, they trust less broadly, they rely more locally, they narrow their world in order to survive it. That is, how money changes society even when it is failing.